Have you ever felt like someone simply disappeared? Not from the world, but from reality itself. As if ripped from the collective memory, like a burned photograph, leaving only the outline of what once existed. Now imagine this happening to a living person, imprisoned, condemned, about to die. Minutes before his execution, he said, his voice firm, without trembling, without pleading, "I didn't die. I was just erased from history." No one in the room reacted, because no one knew for sure who he was. Not the guards, not the prison warden, not the reporters covering the case. Because there was no case. He was there, breathing, but out of time, out of the files, out of any police record prior to his arrest. No fingerprints in the system before 2009. No birth certificates, no visitors, no childhood photos. It was as if he had been manufactured as an adult, or slowly deleted like a file corrupted by grief. The execution followed protocol. But even there, with needles being prepared, there was a discomfort no one could explain. It was like watching someone die without knowing why. Or by whom da have. You ever been there? Faced with something that should make sense, but doesn't. Something that seems real, but is filled with an impossible to fill gap? Because what you're about to discover now may surprise you. This man, this real ghost, claimed not to remember the crime, not to remember the town, not to remember his family. But he remembered, with precision, dates that hadn't yet arrived, names that hadn't yet been revealed, and details that not even the investigators had access to. In his cell, he wrote with his fingernails on the walls. Disjointed phrases, codes, symbols, sometimes the dates of murders that only occurred days later. Other inmates avoided him. They said that when he slept, the cell felt cold, and that he spoke languages no one recognized. A veteran psychiatrist tried to analyze him. He left the prison crying, saying only, "That's not a criminal profile. It's an absence." But if they didn't know who he was, how was he sentenced to death? Who prosecuted him? Who judged him? The court existed. The minutes were there. But the jurors' names were missing. The defense attorney was never found. Again. And the victim? A body, yes, but no history. No relatives. As if the whole case had been built on nothing. As if someone needed him dead, just to ensure he remained forgotten. And yet, even surrounded by this vacuum, there was a glint in his eye, not of malice, but of someone who knew he would still be heard. That last sentence carried more weight than the newspapers could bear. Because when he said, "I didn't die. I was just erased from history," he wasn't just talking about himself. Maybe he was talking about everyone who has disappeared like that. Maybe he was warning us. And the most disturbing thing? Days after the execution, his images began disappearing. From the prison systems, his name was deleted. The execution recordings were corrupted, and the files simply disappeared. But some clues have escaped. Fragments that, when pieced together, reveal something even deeper. More disturbing, something we'll start exploring now. The sentence came swiftly, almost coldly, as if the court had already memorized the outcome. The prosecution presented no solid evidence, no murder weapon, no matching fingerprints, just a history which later turned out to be a flimsy construction, stitched together with generic statements and data too loose to be reliable. But his name was there, on paper, on the records. And that was enough. The conviction was announced. On a rainy morning, without protests, without public outrage, as if the entire process were just a ritual to keep the wheels turning. Except that name. No one knew where it had come from. The records began to fail as soon as they tried to cross-reference them. The social security number didn't exist. The birth database displayed an error. No school, no address, no emergency contact. A man with no origin, but alive, and there. A real ghost with flesh and blood and a look that held more memory than any file. During his days on death row, he spoke little. He refused visitors, even though no one requested one. Sometimes he simply mumbled incoherent words in the darkness, as if he were talking to someone on the other side of the cell. Not another inmate, someone who wasn't there. The cell was cold. Even in summer, guards reported feeling dizzy when approaching the door. And strangest of all, the sniffer dogs refused to pass through the corridor when he was awake. But what was most frightening was when he spoke, because he knew the names of newly arrived inmates. He knew details of unsolved crimes. He knew dates that would only be revealed days later in the news. Once, he said to one of the guards, "You still have 3 nights. After that, something inside you will wake up, and it will never let you sleep again." 3 nights later, the man was found unconscious at home. No one understood. He claimed he'd heard someone banging on the inside of the mirror. Psychologists were called in. One of them, experienced in personality disorders, left prison saying he would never set foot in an evaluation room again. He claimed the inmate didn't have multiple identities, but rather multiple absences, as if each part of him were made from the emptiness of other lives. His thought structure wasn't linear, it was circular, fragmented, with no point of origin, as if his mind were always trying to escape the present, seeking gaps in time. And it was within these gaps that things began to unravel. An anonymous fax arrived at the prison with no return address. It was a copy of a 1976 school report. The student's name was Daniel Cavus, the age matched. The photo was similar, but most disturbing was the internal transfer stamp to a school that had officially closed in 1974. 2 weeks later, this document disappeared from the prison file. No one knew where it went, but the inmate had already mentioned the name Daniel. Once, during an outburst, he shouted, "I'm Voss. I saw what you did. You buried everything." The letters began appearing soon after, handwritten, all addressed to different names, but in the same handwriting. They were found hidden behind the tiles in the cell's bathroom. Some had drawings, others had numbers, but all had a pattern, dates. Dates that, when investigated, matched disappearances filed in the 1970s and 1980s. Forgotten cases. People who vanished without a trace. And in all the letters, a recurring symbol. A circle with a line through the center. It wasn't religious, nor political. None of the investigators recognized it. But in one of the letters he wrote, "When this symbol appears again, it is because the cycle has not been broken." The police began to investigate further. And the more they dug, the more things disappeared. Old files were corrupted. Physical photos lost their definition. Even printed documents, filed by hand, began to vanish, as if someone or something was re-editing reality in real time. A former federal agent involved in the analysis confided, on condition of anonymity, that he had never seen anything like it. He said it was like trying to investigate a moving shadow. Everything slipped. Everything fell apart. Until one day, a prison officer discovered a fragment of audio from a security recording. The date? Undetermined. But the voice was his. It said, "If you found this, you are being erased too." The audio was deleted minutes later. No one acknowledged the deletion. No password was used. But the system registered a change. Made at 3:33 a.m., the same time the inmate usually spoke to himself in his cell. In the end, it wasn't just about a man on death row anymore. It was about something bigger. An invisible web of tampered data, hijacked memories, and switched identities. It was about decisions that shape destinies, even when no one remembers making them. It was about transformation. Not the kind that liberates, but the kind that distorts. His name remained unidentified, but its effects were beginning to spread, because each new clue revealed also carried a consequence. A silenced voice, a hidden truth distorted, and the closer we got to the answer, the more everything seemed to crumble. As if we were looking too closely at something that never wanted to be seen. And it's at this point that the line between what's real and what's manipulated begins to blur. Because some people don't disappear. They're removed intentionally, deliberately as part of something we are still trying to understand. The scar began right at the corner of his left eye and ran down his cheek, as if it had been left there on purpose. It wasn't recent. It didn't appear to have been caused by a fight or a prison accident. It had a different nature. Something meticulous, like a mark. When officers first examined it, they recorded it in the report as physical sign unrelated to crime. But a more observant employee, cross-referencing this description with a forgotten state education system database, found something. A record from 1976, Dunsmore Preparatory School in Oregon. Student, Daniel Cavus, 10 years old. Excellent performance in writing and math. And in the medical field, minor traumatic injury to the left cheek. The coincidence was brutal. The problem? This school had closed 2 years before the date recorded. Not due to bankruptcy, but for structural reasons. When they checked the address, they discovered that the original building had been demolished. Today, in the space, there's a parking lot with no signs. No trace of any children ever studying there. And Daniel? He never graduated. No record of a transfer, no change of residence, just an abrupt end. As if he had ceased to exist at age 11. Most disturbing, when showing the student's photo to the convicted man, he said, "That was the name they gave me." Before the first exchange, no one understood what he meant. But the expression on his face left no doubt. It wasn't a fabrication. That's when the letters emerged. Not the ones from the cell, those had already been turned over for forensic analysis. But a new package sent to the old school building, which had been redirected to the state mailroom. There were 10 envelopes, all written in the same handwriting and signed by different names. Evan, Isaac, M, Thomas, Ash, Leon. But the contents of each envelope were the same, an apology. Always with subtle variations, but with an identical phrase repeated at the end. "I know I was used, but I was weak for accepting it." The recipient was the same in all of them. DKV. These letters had never been opened. Authorities assumed they were part of some protest or school prank at the time. But now, with the connection to the case, it became impossible to ignore. The handwriting, when cross-referenced with the notes written in the cell, revealed a 94% similarity. Someone had begun this cycle long before the arrest. And the letters were a reflection of that. Of fragmented guilt, an attempt to confess without exposing. To speak without being directly heard. Because speaking clearly would have consequences. Meanwhile, inside the penitentiary, reports of the prisoner's behavior became increasingly disturbing. He would spend hours standing still, staring at the wall, as if watching something no one else could see. One early morning, while on patrol, a guard caught him curled up in a fetal position, mumbling dates and serial numbers. It was recorded. It was taken for analysis. The transcript contained, among other codes, the prefix for classified military projects from the 1960s to 1980s, an unsettling connection to research on mind control, dissociative identity, and behavioral modulation. Nothing was officially confirmed, but the pattern was real. And the impact behind the scenes was immediate. A government agent appeared, silent, out of uniform. He requested restricted access to the prisoner. He spent less than 20 minutes with him. And upon leaving, he ordered the report sealed with a red seal, confidential indefinitely. After that encounter, he stopped speaking for 11 days. Not a word, not a reaction. Just that fixed gaze fixed on the ceiling, as if listening to a truth that could not be shared. When he spoke again, he said only one sentence: "I accepted." But they changed the rules. And with that, another detail came to light. Among the letters found at the school, there was one dated 1992, written in pencil. The paper was aged but in perfect condition, and in the lower right corner, a fingerprint. It was his, the convicted man's. The print was confirmed by forensic analysis. The problem? In 1992, he didn't officially exist yet. The chronology was beginning to break down. An irregular timeline, elements out of place. The kind of inconsistency that only appears when someone tries to hide what has already been done. Not just a crime, but an experiment. A forced transformation. A process of deliberate fragmentation. The kind of thing that, if confirmed, would completely change the notion of justice and truth. Because it's no longer about who he killed, but who he was before he was molded. Before they accepted he was the ideal culprit. An even more disturbing revelation emerged when they cross-referenced old data with records of child disappearances between 1975 and 1983. A pattern began to repeat itself. Boys between the ages of 8 and 11, all with a history of above-average academic performance, all with absent or institutionalized parents, all with some kind of scar. What did these details have in common? They matched descriptions of identity suppression and psychological conditioning projects. None of this was officially confirmed, of course, but the data was there. Ignoring it would be dishonest, to say the least. And it was in this context that a previously hidden name emerged, Dr. Harlan Quist, a psychiatrist who died in 2001. He worked for the State Department between 1969 and 1982. His name appears, discreetly, as a counselor for a group of behaviorally unusual youths at a base in Northern California. None of these youths have had their identities revealed, but a leaked report cites a DK as the primary subject. The same report mentions the use of emotional blocks and behavioral substitution as a way to test adaptive responses in simulated guilt scenarios. Too technical a word, but with brutal implications. Because, if this is true, the man who was convicted may never have been himself. He may have been a reflection, a construct, a shell over a trauma that wasn't his. This is where the line between justice and manipulation begins to blur. What drives someone to accept a crime they didn't commit? Fear? Emptiness? Or an emotional programming so deep that the very notion of choice dissolves? A molded mindset, distorted decisions, a pre-written script of pain and silence. The hardest part is accepting that perhaps all of this was done knowingly, with approval, with witnesses, and with the certainty that no one would dare dig too deep. But this excavation is only beginning, and what emerges from it isn't just a miscarriage of justice. It's an entire mechanism designed to fabricate disappearances, to erase stories at their roots. Because some names don't disappear, they are removed with surgical precision. And when one of them escapes oblivion, the system reacts. It always reacts. He was judged like a monster. The kind of case the media loves to turn into a spectacle. A family brutally murdered in their home, at midnight, with no signs of forced entry. Mother, father, 9-year-old daughter, all killed with clinical precision. Neighbors spoke of a black car parked days earlier, always at the same time. One of the veteran detectives swore it was personal, but nothing matched. Nothing connected that man, the same man who claimed he couldn't remember his own name, to the scene of the crimes. Nothing until he himself confessed, cold, direct. Without tears, he simply said, "It was me." And for a moment, the system breathed a sigh of relief. The gears needed someone to blame. He volunteered, but the relief was short-lived. 2 days later, in court, in front of cameras and eyes eager for punishment, he raised his head, looked straight at the judge and said, "I said I did it because you wanted to hear it." The room froze. He repeated, his voice dry without hesitation, "You Only believe those who scream in fear. I no longer have a voice. The silence that followed wasn't one of doubt. It was one of discomfort. Because no one there knew how to react to someone who wasn't seeking innocence or guilt. They just wanted them to stop pretending they were. Seeing the obvious, the prosecution tried to argue that he was manipulating the system. But the more they talked, the flimsier it all sounded. There were no fingerprints, no DNA, no eyewitnesses. The only connection was himself and his own confession, made under duress, based on an interrogation lasting nearly 17 hours without a break. The public defender requested a psychological evaluation. The report was sealed, 30 pages. Almost all of it redacted. But one sentence escaped the black box: personality with induced dissociative traits and possible conditioning of responses associated with authority commands. What does this mean? Simply put, he may have been trained to confess, to obey, to erase traces of himself when placed under certain conditions. This is not fiction. There are records, documents, including declassified CIA reports, detailing experiments in the 1950s and 1960s that sought exactly that: to create people programmed to respond to commands with blind obedience. The question now was no longer about the crime, it was about the workings of his mind. Who taught him to yield? Parallel investigations discovered that he was admitted to a psychiatric institution between 1987 and 1989. The facility's name was Briarwood Facility, a center supposedly dedicated to rehabilitating young people with conduct disorders, but it no longer exists. No medical records, no patient history. The facility was consumed by a fire, officially attributed to an electrical fault. However, the fire department's report contains a bizarre observation: multiple and deliberate combustion sources, intentional arson, burning files. A retired nurse who worked there at the time agreed to an interview on condition of anonymity. He said something that deeply impacted the investigation. There was a wing where the boys had no names, they were just numbers, and they behaved as if they had been emptied. The description matched the man's behavior on death row: prolonged silences, a lack of emotional response, and those broken sentences that seemed more like internal commands than free thoughts, as if he were being guided by something within, something ancient. Behind the scenes, pressure mounted. Independent journalists began connecting the dots, revealing forgotten data and causing unease in institutions that preferred to remain unremembered. But even as the evidence mounted, the case was not reopened. The system resisted, and he seemed to have already accepted this. When asked why he confessed to something he didn't do, he replied, "Because the silence hurt me more than the guilt. And because that day, my mind spoke louder than my memory." That's not a common response. It's the kind of phrase that carries scars. At one of the final hearings, he looked at his lawyer as if asking permission to say something. And then he spoke, looking at everyone present. "You want justice, but it's not here. It's buried in unsigned files, in names you forgot to look for. I'm just the tip of the iceberg." After that, he returned to his usual silence. The psychologist who was treating him made a peculiar observation in her clinical diary: intermittent speech pattern, cognitive fragmentation, signs consistent with implanted memory. This observation was never officially included in the records. It was removed from the case soon afterward, transferred to another state. No one else had direct access to it except government agents. As the weeks passed, the situation surrounding the case began to grow more murky. Evidence began to disappear. The original letter apologizing him vanished. The recording of the 17-hour interrogation corrupted. The full psychological report sealed in the national interest. And most disturbing, the body of the child he allegedly murdered was exhumed at the defense's request and revealed a date of death inconsistent with the prosecution's timeline. But this information was never presented to the jury. It was deemed irrelevant to the merits. The case was being stifled, little by little, as if something or someone had too much to lose if the truth came out. An entire system mobilized to keep the narrative intact, because, perhaps dismantling, this case would require reopening many others, and each one would carry more erased names, more silenced voices, more truths buried under concrete and secrecy. The impact of this would be devastating, and so he was left there, awaiting execution, like a file one would rather forget. But even surrounded by silence, he still whispered disjointed phrases that seemed to carry codes. Fragments of something much larger. In one of the last official records before the execution, a stray phrase was noted in the medical record: "I didn't die. I was just erased from history." These words echoed again in the corridors of the penitentiary, even after death. Some say they imagined it. Others swear they actually heard it. Regardless, one thing became clear to those who allowed themselves to see beyond it. Not every disappearance is an end. Some are just the beginning of something the world isn't yet ready to discover. But what he left behind, between the lines, in the pauses, in the almost imperceptible gestures, still unsettles. As if there were layers of history no one dared to decipher. Fragments that might be scattered in other cold cases, other lives erased, other truths locked behind sealed doors for convenience. Do you feel that way too? That sense that something wrong is being forcibly kept right, as if there were an invisible script being followed, and any deviation must be silenced. And this is where we find ourselves, at that precise point where curiosity and indignation intersect. Because if you've come this far, it wasn't by chance. You also see what distracted eyes miss. You realize that not every confession is true, that not all justice is fair, and that some stories need to be told more than once, until the truth finally echoes louder than the silence. If this kind of content provokes you, captivates you, transforms you from within, then subscribe now. Not for vanity, not for numbers, but because each new subscription shows that there are still people willing to look deeper, to excavate what has been buried, and most importantly, to keep these stories alive. Your presence here helps give them the energy to continue, because every time you subscribe, comment, share, you push this message further away from oblivion. There's so much that hasn't been said yet, so many names that haven't been heard, and what comes next may reveal the missing detail needed to understand it all. The thread that weaves together the backstory of this plot, where mental scars matter more than physical evidence. The next piece is closer than it seems, and it was hidden in a place no one thought to look. The first thing they found when they cleared the cell was a torn notebook covered with duct tape. The pages seemed random, but they followed a sequence of collapses. They weren't texts nor letters. They were aggressive scribbles, dense, heavy strokes, made as if scratching to silence thoughts. Between the scribbles, loose words, cities that didn't exist, names of people no one could locate, and a date written dozens of times, September 14th. No year, no context. Just the obsessive repetition of something that was never explained. Beside the notebook, a Bible, soaked at the edges. The mark of dried blood between the pages of Job. Chapter 3, verse 11. Why did I not die at birth? Why did I not perish when I came out of the womb? The question seems to echo from someone who no longer knows if they are anyone. The Bible had the name Seth A. on the back cover, but no one with that name had been registered in the prison system in the last 20 years, and the blood was compatible with type O negative, the same as his. The same blood type as 6% of the world's population, a small detail, but within a story without roots. Any detail becomes key. And then came the most disturbing part. A diary with a dinosaur cover. Childish. Weren't childish at all. The drawings didn't show little houses, families, or happy days. They showed bodies, silhouettes. On the ground, circles around empty eyes. Some drawings were marked with dates. Dates that coincided with disappearances in small towns around Alabama and Georgia between 1982 and 1989. Cold cases, unsolved, that were only connected by those brave enough to compare the diary's images with old reports. No one had done that before, because no one thought those pages had any value. An error of judgment that nearly buried the truth for good. The witnesses who attempted to piece together the puzzle were of little help. Each offered a version that contradicted the previous. A veteran prison guard swore he was mute, that he had never heard him utter a single word. A psychiatric intern said he was brilliant, verbose, and lucid. Another claimed he communicated only through gestures. Another that he read books in advanced Latin. They all seemed right and yet completely wrong. A prisoner who shared a cell for 2 months said he would wake up in the middle of the night to the sound of someone repeating prayers in reverse order. The same prisoner reported finding a note hidden under his mattress with letters drawn as if made with teeth. When he read it, it read, "They want me to forget, but I even remember what never happened." This was never officially recorded, but the account is contained in a handwritten letter submitted to the public defender's office months before the execution. And as fragmented and out of place as it all seems, there's something that connects these pieces. Something that perhaps isn't in the words, but in the spaces between them. In the silences, in the pauses, in the contradictions. Because no one is so confused for no reason. No one has so many versions of themselves by chance. It's as if he'd been shattered and left behind in pieces. Each object like a memory left on the margins. Each testimony like an attempt to rewrite a man no one wanted to understand. And if you look closely, you'll realize this story isn't just about him. It's about everything they try to hide when the truth is too inconvenient. It's about people erased by silent decisions, by lost records, by versions molded to fit pre-made sentences. It's about how many others are trapped inside stories that aren't theirs, waiting perhaps for someone to finally see what was always there. But no one wanted to see. That's why you need to stay with me until the end. Because what's yet to be revealed has the power to turn everything upside down. And if you've made it this far, it's because you already sense that this story hides something bigger. I only ask this of you, stay with me, not for me, but for all who have been similarly silenced. They deserve to be heard. And you can be the voice that rescues what they tried to erase. Dr. Elliot Graves had the kind of track record that commands respect even before he speaks. 35 years inside the labyrinths of the human mind, dealing with ordinary-looking monsters, he wasn't easily frightened. But something about that man made him back off. In the third session, without warning, the psychiatrist delivered his laconic report and abandoned the case. No one understood why. And he never fully explained. He only said one sentence that still echoes through the halls of the psychiatric ward. He knew things no one in their right mind could possibly know. Things that haven't even happened yet. The sentence was written down, filed away, ignored. But those who read it never forgot it. Graves wrote that during the sessions, time seemed to break. As if I were inside a memory that wasn't mine, but he made it seem like it was. An almost physical sensation of being trapped in something that didn't follow the normal laws of cause and effect. It was as if the inmate not only remembered the past, but anticipated the emotional consequences of the questions. As if he had rehearsed the pain, the hesitation, the silence, and knew exactly what it would cause in whoever listened. In one conversation, he described, in surgical detail, a car accident involving Graves's brother. Details that were never released. Details that even the psychiatrist himself no longer remembered. The sharp curve, the sneaker mark on the asphalt, the sound of the radio that continued playing even after the impact. When Graves asked how he knew, his answer was a whisper. I don't know, I feel it. Like it's all inside me, but it doesn't belong to me. This answer echoed like a dirty echo. And worst of all, it didn't seem like an attempt to manipulate or impress. It was delivered with the same naturalness as someone recounting a recurring dream. A dream that repeats itself so often that it loses its meaning as a dream. The psychiatrist also reported an unusual shift in his own perception of time. Sessions lasted 45 minutes by the clock, but he swore hours had passed. As if he were being sucked into a spiral where the minutes no longer obeyed logic. After leaving the case, Graves disappeared for a while. He said he needed to clear his mind. He went weeks without answering calls. He left the clinic. When he returned, he refused new patients for 2 months. The only thing he kept on his schedule was personal therapy, something he had never done before. According to close colleagues, he suffered panic attacks and began reporting dreams in which he heard the same phrase, repeated in a hoarse, distant voice. I am what you forgot. Always the same phrase, always the same outcome. He would wake up sweating, with the feeling that someone had whispered in his ear. When asked later, in an informal interview, if he believed the man was a fraud, a manipulator, Graves simply replied, manipulators play with what exists. He played with what no one sees. He added, I don't know if he was human in the sense we know it, but I know he was real. Too real. These words were never entered into the record. They were spoken in the background during an informal recording used only for internal study. The final report he left on record simply said, patient presents severe dissociation, with temporal ruptures in his personal narrative and signs of unlocalizable emotional trauma. Aware of his situation, but unable to explain it using linear logic. Practical translation, no one knew what was happening to him. And perhaps he knew, but couldn't say. Or worse, he didn't know, and was simply experiencing something others pretended didn't exist. The impact was immediate. The prison's psychiatric system was overhauled. New guidelines on altered perceptions of time in extreme confinement began circulating among professionals. A discreet way of saying that something there didn't make sense, but without admitting that it was out of control. Because admitting it would mean opening the door to the unacceptable, that perhaps he wasn't just a criminal, but a vector of something bigger. Something no one could name, and that's where many people start to back down. Because when logic breaks down, fear takes over. And anyone who works with the mind knows, fear is the most honest symptom there is. It doesn't lie, it doesn't fake. It only appears when it senses something is truly wrong. And everyone who crossed its path felt it. Now, if you've been following this far, you've probably already realized this isn't about one man. It's about what that man represents, the flaw in the system, the error in the margins, the truth hidden between protocols and cold reports. Because there are stories that don't fit into criminal records. There are souls that weren't made to fit into diagnoses. And there are questions that bother because they don't want answers. They want permanence. So I invite you to continue diving into this abyss with me. Because the deeper we go, the clearer it becomes that there's something there that's never been said out loud. And maybe now is the time. But only if you're willing to see what's always been behind the eyes of those the world chose to forget. It was as if the system had tried to hide it and failed. The recording wasn't in any active directory. It had no metadata. No technician could explain how it had emerged. It just appeared, like an echo. A digital whisper of something that should never be heard. The voice was his, without a doubt. Low, drawn out with uncomfortable pauses. The same cadence he used on death row, when he said things like, I was never born at the right time, or there are places they don't forget, they only pretend. But there was something else in this recording. A dangerous lucidity. The speech was clear, direct, no hesitation. When someone is erased, they continue to exist in the spaces where they were forgotten. That phrase wouldn't leave the investigators' minds, nor the prison guards. One of them, Brian Kessler, became so obsessed that he began sleeping in the prison office, reviewing all the old tapes, scanning physical files, trying to understand if the recording was real or part of some kind of internal manipulation. He found other things. Redacted documents with the name Samuel Lull, references to sessions with psychologists who had never worked there, and a sequence of handwritten notes that seemed to belong to the convict himself. Repetitive symbols, patterns that resembled ancient languages. No one could translate them. An anthropologist was called in. He said it resembled Norse runes adapted for some kind of ritual, but there were missing pieces. Many missing pieces. The recording began circulating within internal security groups. Soon, almost everyone in the prison knew of its existence, but no one could confirm its origin. When the unit's management decided to delete the file, it disappeared on its own. Literally, it vanished from the server, from backups, and even from the flash drives that had been used to copy it. All that remained were the reports, the restless memory, and a piece transcribed by hand by Kessler. He copied it word for word, and in the final days before requesting leave due to severe mental instability, he wrote a letter stating that the recording was not just proof of life, it was proof of presence, and that he believed that the man had never left his cell. The cell, by the way, was isolated. No one used it again. The official reason was structural damage, but reports from the guards said otherwise. A padlock that opened by itself, a light that flickered for no apparent reason, and a specific smell, described as wet earth, even though there was no sign of moisture in the room. Some nights, according to the early morning shifts, scratching could be heard, but no animals were found. No sounds were recorded. Cell number 47 became a kind of taboo. Anyone who entered came back a different person, silent, avoiding questions. Meanwhile, testimonies began to emerge from other prisoners, claiming to have seen the man walking in the courtyard. Weeks after the execution, one described in detail the way he walked, slightly bent over, as if carrying something invisible on his back. Another said he looked directly at him, whispered something, and then vanished into thin air. No one really believed him. But then again, no one could completely ignore it. It was as if death hadn't interrupted anything. It had merely displaced his presence to another layer. Investigators began cross-referencing the data with records of prisoners who had died under similar circumstances. 3 cases stood out. Men with no clear identity, a history of being erased, similar behavior, and all died claiming innocence. In 2 of these cases, similar phrases were found in the final belongings. I wasn't killed, I was transferred. The phrase became an obsession for 2 independent journalists who had been following the case since the first hearing. They gathered recordings, letters, and excerpts from interrogations and constructed a mental map with connections that linked not only the deaths, but also institutions, psychiatrists, and rehabilitation centers that had been closed for over 30 years. There was an invisible subterranean thread connecting everything. The voice on the recording repeated, in different passages, that the truth is not in the facts, but in what cannot be documented. An ambiguous, almost philosophical phrase, but it coincided with an old note made by Dr. Graves, the psychiatrist who abandoned the case. His trauma is greater than anyone I've ever interviewed. It's not pain. It's absence, as if he's been ripped from reality slowly, in layers. A patient who isn't trying to remember. He's trying not to disappear completely. When confronted by the press during a brief press conference, the prison director simply said, "This is fantasy. The execution was real. The identity has been confirmed. Case closed." But reporters discovered that the name listed on the death certificate never existed in the national database, and that the body never made it to the morgue. It simply disappeared. The noises remained. The lost recording, the sealed cell, the phrase written in blood beneath the bunk. Silence has a name, but no one dares pronounce it. A feeling that perhaps he had never sought innocence, but rather memory. And there's more. Much more, because in one of the CCTV tapes from 2005, a figure appears for 2 seconds in the background of a closed-off wing. No one had walked there for months, and this figure is carrying a Bible, just like the one in his belongings. The technicians who tried to restore the image say it has no source metadata. It doesn't belong to any real camera. It was as if the system itself had recorded something that didn't happen. Now tell me, how do we ignore this? Perhaps that's what bothers me most. The idea that someone could be forgotten in life. Not just ignored, but slowly erased until not even their name resonates. How many people do you know who walk around as if they were invisible? People who carry deep stories but never had the space to tell them. Because deep down, that's what it's about being seen, being heard. Even if it's too late. Even if it's already hurt too much. If any part of this touched you, if any sentence resonated, leave a word in the comments. Just one. Forgotten. Write it down. And if you want, add what it means to you. Sometimes we need to let it out, to write so we don't implode inside. There are things no one will understand, but someone here might understand. Maybe they feel the same way. And that's why this space matters. Because even when it seems like we're talking about someone far away, the truth is that these stories contain pieces of all of us. Your memory could be what keeps alive a truth. World would rather bury, write, vent. I'm reading everything. And the next step in this story, carries something that is perhaps more personal than we'd like to admit. One of the letters was written in red ink. It didn't look like blood, but the intensity of the color gave that impression. The message was short, almost childlike. I'm still there. I keep waking up in that place. The paper was folded in 4, and on the back, a strange symbol like a spiral with a line through it, hand-drawn, as if it were a recurring personal symbol. In all, there were 25 envelopes, each addressed to different names, different dates, and different origins, but with a single connection. The same sender, whose identity no one knew. The forensic team took weeks to cross-reference the data. The letters had been written at different times. Some referenced historical events, even before the arrested man's official birth. It was as if he were writing from outside time. One, for example, spoke of a boy's death in a fire in 1964. The details were incredibly intimate, almost like a diary entry from someone who saw the scene from the inside. Another mentioned a woman buried alive in 1982, but that woman's body was never found. Only after the letter was written was the backyard of her former home exhumed, and the bones were found there. The name signed on the letter, Henry Whitaker, the name of the victim's own stepson. But the prisoner bore no relation to that name. It was as if each letter were a confession of something he couldn't remember doing, and yet, at the same time, remembered with too much pain to speak aloud. One letter, the most crumpled, simply said, "They split me into parts. I am all of these." And what seemed like a delusion became a clue. In the course of the investigation, an unusual hypothesis emerged. The man had assumed different identities throughout his life. Not by choice, but due to mental breakdowns that fragmented his memory and his personality. A kind of extreme psychic defense. Profound dissociation. But even the most skeptical experts noticed something unusual. It wasn't just different behaviors. It was distinct accents, body postures that changed. Even his signature varied. One moment he was a history teacher. The next, a 12-year-old orphan. The next, someone named Daniel, who kept repeating that he shouldn't have gone back to the house. With the broken stairs, psychology tried to explain, but there was always an open question, something beyond the mind, because everything indicated he had actually been to the places he said, even without records, even without photos, and it was a letter that led investigators to an abandoned cabin in a forgotten forest. A 3-hour drive, a 20-minute walk. There, under the floorboards, buried in a rusty box, were personal items belonging to a man missing since 1993, including an identity card. With a photo, the photo was his. Same face, same cut on his chin, but a different name. And a mismatched date of birth. The impact was immediate. The police could no longer justify the man's arrest as a simple murder case. Now it was a deeper enigma, something that shook the very fabric of identity, the very fabric of truth. He seemed to carry memories that didn't belong to him alone, or that shouldn't belong to anyone else. At the psychiatric hospital, a nurse said something that never left the records. One night, she heard him talking to someone in his room, but he was alone, and he spoke in a childish voice, asking, "Why didn't Mommy ever come back for us?" The next day, when questioned, he denied everything. He said he didn't remember saying it, but his eyes were red, as if he'd been crying all night. It was at this point that a prosecutor in the case suggested he be included in an experimental neurological monitoring program. They wanted to understand the spikes in brain changes that occurred during dissociative states. But the project was canceled after 2 days. According to the report, the devices recorded brain activity corresponding to 2 simultaneous patterns, with irreconcilable rhythms, as if 2 brains were in a single body. And then, everything went black. The system crashed. No data could be recovered, only residual audio, a low noise, and an incomplete sentence: "If I wake up, he's gone." 2. This day, experts try to interpret what that meant, but the hidden truth surrounding this case seems to elude any technical explanation. It's as if we're dealing not with a common criminal, but with a phenomenon, an entity shaped by traumas so profound they've transcended time itself, a distorted reflection of pain that hasn't healed. A forced transformation, imposed, born in silence. Stay with me until the end. There's something that hasn't yet been said. And when it is, it will stir up something many people prefer to pretend they've forgotten. The note was written in the same handwriting as the letters found. Small, slanted, with the same abnormal curvature of the letter S. This set off a silent alarm within the team, still trying to understand what lay before them. This wasn't just another cold case among files of unsolved crimes. There was a dark pattern, meticulously buried under decades of omission. And at the center of it all, he's still silent, but with his eyes always open, as if waiting for time to run out. The base's name was Fort Ryden, officially deactivated in 1986. Locals swore they heard the sounds of machinery behind the fences in the early hours of the morning, a sort of intermittent hum, followed by lights coming from the ground. In public records, almost nothing remained about the unit's operations, only a program classified as neurobehavioral reactive response. In extreme environments, his name was nowhere to be found. But among the forgotten papers in the station's basement, a blurry copy of an experimental form caught my eye. The registration code was illegible, but the photo, even faded, showed that face. Beardless, less tired, younger, signed with a different name, Marcus Keene. Date, 1983. If the data were real, he would have been institutionalized at age 12, under observation for severe disruptive behavior and cognitive tendencies incompatible with normative human standards. In other words, he saw things no one else could see. He heard voices no test could explain. He reproduced conversations that hadn't yet taken place. And he spoke languages he'd never learned. This in a boy with no medical history, no known family, and no official documentation. During a routine interview with a retired federal agent, a sentence slipped out amid an all too long silence. He wasn't meant to be outside. He was never meant to leave the base. The recording of the deposition froze shortly afterward. The audio became corrupted, but the agent's look was captured on video. It was panic, genuine, from someone who saw more than he could tell. That became the final piece of what began to form as a silent theory among the senior investigators. He wasn't the killer. He was the file, a body kept alive, carrying layers of memories that won't fade. Part of a project that spiraled out of control, perhaps a psychic experiment, perhaps something even deeper, an attempt to transfer trauma to another mind, to shape identity from repeated pain. And if this is real, how many more would there be? The question became a source of wonder, especially after an incident in 2011. A psychiatric ward employee disappeared for 17 hours inside the prison itself. The cameras didn't show her leaving, nor returning. When she was found, she was in the same hallway, but wearing different clothes, and with a blank expression. The most frightening thing was what she said. "I just remember a boy telling me not to look away." The same boy described in the letters. The same one who appeared in the children's drawings in the diary. Always with crossed-out eyes, as if looking at him would undo something. This recurring presence became a symbol of collective trauma within the penitentiary. Guards began refusing to work late nights. Psychiatrists left the case. The prosecutor, in the original case, never spoke publicly again. And the prisoner? He was still there, sitting, almost motionless, but with new marks on his hands, as if he were scratching himself inside. Those who had direct contact with him reported the same thing. A profound fatigue after the encounters, a loss of time, a feeling of disorientation. One investigator even developed a rare form of retrograde amnesia, forgetting events from the past 10 years. The only thing he kept saying, in a loop, was, "He reminded me of something that hadn't happened yet." By this point, it was no longer just a criminal case. It was a collision between reality and what the mind rejects. A confrontation between memory and what lies buried beneath it. Every bit of the investigation seemed to lead not to a culprit, but to a creation. As if he were the product of a wrong decision made long ago. As if every crime, every letter, every voice were an echo of something still repeating itself. And perhaps it is. Because 2 months ago, in another state, a young man was arrested for attempted murder. During interrogation, he drew the same symbol, the spiral with the line through the middle. Without knowing anything. Without ever having had any contact with the case, he said the drawing came to him in a dream, and that a voice whispered the name Marcus. In the plural, that's what makes this story impossible to ignore. Because it doesn't just belong to the past, it spreads, like an invisible crack in the walls of consciousness. And with each person who listens, something within them awakens. In the oppressive silence of the cell, where time seemed to melt like wax, he stood there, motionless, like a shadow that refused to disappear. Death row had never seen such a solitary execution. No applause, no shouts, no watchful eyes of the press, searching for a condemned man's last breath. Only the empty echo of a bureaucratic routine that treated that life as if it were nothing more than a number crossed off the system. He wasn't a headline. He wasn't a warning to the spectators. He wasn't even a man worthy of remembrance. He was merely a real ghost, waiting for his time. As the lights dimmed and the execution chamber filled with heavy gloom, his voice rang out, low, barely audible to those present, but forever etched in the memories of those close enough to hear. Erasing someone is easier than killing, and crueler. The sentence cut through the silence like a sharp blade, leaving a trail of unease. It wasn't just a lament, it was an accusation. A secret spilled in the final moments of a life already stifled by years of neglect and oblivion. As soon as the injection began to take effect, the prison lights flickered violently. An electrical signal, a glitch in the system, an inexplicable interference. The CCTV monitor picked up a familiar noise. It was the audio from 2003, that same forgotten recording that was only now beginning to be deciphered, resurfacing like a specter from the past to haunt the present. The deep voice, laden with dark wisdom, echoed through the cold walls of death. When someone is erased, they continue to exist in the spaces where they were forgotten. It was as if the system, the prison, even fate itself had tried to warn that the erasure would not be complete, that it still inhabited the dark corners of history, even when society pretended not to see it. The execution, so silent and devoid of any ceremony, became a turning point. The moment when the erased ceased to be invisible, if only to those who dared to look beyond the veil. The guards reported that, in the following hours, there was an unexplained increase in electrical activity in the cell block where he was confined. Lights flickered in strange patterns, computers turned on and off by themselves, sensors registered movement even when the cell block was empty. The cameras captured fleeting, indistinct shadows that seemed to move of their own accord. One of them, a veteran of the prison, said quietly that he felt a chill on the back of his neck, unlike anything he had ever felt before. Something was alive there, something beyond rational explanation. It wasn't just the prison that felt his presence. Within the official archives, a line caught attention again. "The body is where it all began." This phrase, written in one of the letters found, took on new significance. The police reopened an old investigation, searching abandoned lots and houses linked to the family of the victim of the alleged crime. One, in particular, caught their attention: a forgotten property in the countryside, with an old cistern buried in the backyard. When the bones were found, they were unidentified, but the psychological impact on the team was profound. It wasn't the family they were looking for. They were burned, fragmented bones, but they seemed to carry a silent, brutal story, a hidden truth that no court could decipher. And most disturbing of all, the feeling was that they didn't belong to the victim, but to the man himself, the one who had become a ghost. Behind the prison walls, amid the shadows of bureaucracy and security systems, a silent transformation began to take shape. What seemed like an end became the beginning of profound questions about identity, memory, and justice. If the execution had erased the man, the truth continued to live on, pulsing in the cracks of reality. And this impact reverberated far beyond the penitentiary walls. The behind-the-scenes details of that moment revealed more than just a man's death. They revealed the collapse of a mindset that still tries to fit complex lives into simplistic boxes. A system that prefers to erase what it doesn't understand, rather than face the uncomfortable truths that insist on emerging. And there, in the silence of that last breath, was the scream no one wanted to hear. The decisions made throughout that process now became unanswered questions. Who really was this man? What was he carrying? And most importantly, what had the world lost by erasing him from history? Behind-the-scenes revelations revealed that the mystery was deeper than it seemed. The hidden truth wasn't just about a crime, but about an erased existence that insisted on being remembered. And as the shadows slowly dissipated from the cell, where he spent his final moments, the mystery remained intact. Because in truth, he never died. He was just erased. A real ghost, living in the invisible lines between oblivion and memory. After the execution, what should have been merely the end became a disturbing blur in the fabric of reality. The prison walls seemed to swallow everything that connected him to that man. Photos disappeared, as if they had never been taken. Official reports were erased, digital files silently erased, and the recordings that recorded his final days were lost in systems that claimed inexplicable technical failures. It was as if his own story was being rewritten by invisible hands, erased by whoever decided he should not exist beyond death row. The prisoners, who had previously whispered his name amidst the tension, began to forget. Voices that told stories of him fell silent. Memories faded into the air. Staff members who crossed his path swore, with the conviction of those with a heavy heart, that they had never seen him. His presence, which once occupied the cold space of the cells and the heavy silence of the corridors, vanished from all memories, as if it were a mist dissipating in the sunlight. But not everyone was affected by this selective amnesia. One employee, responsible for the department where he remained, carried a different burden. She held his words like a secret whispered in the dark. "I remember. Because he said I would be erased too." It was more than a veiled threat, it was a cruel prophecy, a warning that the erasure wasn't exclusive to him. And weeks later, she vanished. Vanished without a trace, leaving behind only the shadow of a promise fulfilled. No one could explain. Not the police, not her colleagues. As if she had been swallowed by a void that consumed everything around her, this disappearance did not go unnoticed. Amidst the prison corridors and the authorities' offices, a silent fear began to spread. Something much greater than a simple condemned man was beginning to take on a form that defied logic, an invisible but tangible transformation that altered people's mindsets, erased memories, and even erased people themselves. A phenomenon that transcended the limits of justice and science, that penetrated the depths of what was known about human beings. The hidden truth that emerged wasn't just about an individual, but about a silent, relentless force that consumed stories, faces, and lives. A presence that didn't need a body to exist, and that had the power to destroy the very essence of existence. Its impact reverberated far beyond the prison walls. It was like an echo that reached the deepest corners of the collective consciousness, challenging everything we believed about memory, identity, and what it truly means to disappear. The accounts of those who still dared to remember began to become disconnected fragments. Voices in interviews, testimonies that seemed to come from nightmares, but which held a tenuous thread of reality. They spoke of shadows in the empty cells, whispers that penetrated the bars, the feeling of being watched by something that could not be seen, only felt. A mystery that consumed not only that man, but anyone who had any connection with him, directly or indirectly. This gradual and calculated erasure revealed a decision that transcended the court and the prison system. A decision that stirred the mindset of an invisible power, with a control that goes beyond physical and legal prisons. It was absolute control over existence, the manipulation of memories, and the denial of truth. And at the center of this plot, a question that echoed powerfully. How far does the power of those who decide who deserves to be remembered or forgotten extend? The latest revelations began to emerge from unexpected quarters. From long time employees, investigators who had been dismissed, distant relatives searching for clues in abandoned files. Everyone felt the pressure of a mystery that refused to be solved, of a truth that, if revealed, could shake the foundations of the entire system. Because what began as the story of a man who was erased became a mirror of what society chooses to hide. This story, fragmented and full of shadows, is not just about him. It is about the fragility of collective memory and the price we pay when we allow entire lives to be erased from the record of humanity. With each missing piece, with each forgotten face, a part of our own understanding of what it means to exist is lost. It is a spiral of pain and silence, where truth is hidden and mystery deepens. If you've made it this far, it's because you know this story isn't just about a man who was erased. It's about the weight of memory, the truth they insist on hiding, and the justice that never came for him, or for so many others who were swallowed by silence. If this message reached you, if it resonated with you, let me know in the comments. It could be I'm with you until the end, or this message was for me. I want to know who truly understood what lies behind this curtain of oblivion. And if during this time you've felt the weight of this story, perhaps this video deserves a like, not out of vanity, but because each sign is a step toward not letting this truth be lost. It's a small act of resistance against erasure, against this conspiracy that tries to make the invisible remain invisible. We're in this together, sharing the same restlessness, searching for what they don't want us to find. There's a video here that complements all this. Another piece of this dark puzzle that helps you understand even more what lies beyond what they tell you. Click there and stay with me there. Because these stories are meant to be unraveled in layers, and what you discover next could change everything again. Stay with me.